Hey everyone, and welcome to my Procreate 4 demo for the piece I call The Disciple. So we're returning to a piece for A Village Corrupted, which is the sort of IP that I've been developing when I've had some time. It's something that I'm actually pretty passionate about, but it's not really going to go anywhere quite yet. Right now it's going to sort of hover around as as these types of little character portraits, but just know there's a lot more going on here. I'm not going to show any of it yet. So for this, I decided that I wanted to do a bit of a monk type character, but I wanted to try and get them out of some of the standard monk stuff, which of course this character is going to ultimately have some monkey stuff, but for now it's what I wanted to focus on was how could I do like a really gothic monk. What could I bring into it that sort of felt like a monk that was going to be part of the A Village Corrupted character lineup. So you can see here, I knew what I wanted his base look to be right away. So here's a guy with no armor on and just a bit of a body type. And then you can see here I started adding in spikes because I felt this was something that I hadn't really seen on a monk before. And that's sort of the entire genesis of this character. It's like, okay, how do I bring in some of the monk stuff, but then bring in all of this gothic, all these gothic elements as well. So this is the rough sort of doodling. After I did his initial body type, I actually put this down for a while, and it wasn't until much later that I came back in and picked up the spike arm idea. So you can see I really wanted to get into drawing on this, even though I should say the clean drawings on this, even though I didn't have the exact way I was going to take him down. Sometimes I get really impatient and I want to get to stuff, and since it's digital, I know I can always focus on other elements later. So right now we're focusing on the face and the bandages and the fact that he's blind, or at the very least appears to be blind. I also sort of knew I wanted to do this like sort of big bushy hair and a big bushy beard, and then have it be sort of bound up in the center with these wrappings. So there was some visuals that I knew I wanted to capture, but his exact purpose I didn't exactly know yet until I got to more of his costuming and sort of what he was going to bring to the table that would be special compared to the other characters. So right now we're just sort of in that, tightening the lines, making sure this is all crispy, phase of the drawing, and I use times like this where I've sort of rushed into tight lines to contemplate the rest of the design. So while I'm doing this, I am figuring out what I want his like theme to be. Where do I want to take this? What's going to be the special thing that I'm going to actually do? So I know that I've got this special spiky, gothic-y leather arm thing, and it's on a monk, and that is maybe at the very least a little bit different, but I don't really know if it's all that different, but it's sort of enough to go on. And at some point during this, I started considering other aspects too, like do I want him to be like scarred up because he's in this sort of hostile world, but he just fights with his fists, and just ideas like that. Except that the very first character I did in this series, the Battler, he actually has quite a monk feel to him because he fights with his hands and he's got scars all over his body, and I didn't want to get too repetitive. I didn't want to do the exact same thing. So as much as it's completely natural for me to just throw scars on characters because scars are always cool, I tried to resist that as much as possible and start searching for something else that would be special here, special for this character. My wife and I were in the middle of a huge Seinfeld rewatch when I was drawing this, so as I'm staring at this hair part, I'm basically seeing Seinfeld in my mind. So it's not necessarily the most creative thing to watch when you're trying to be inspired for gothic stuff, but whatever gets you through a long drawing, I guess. But at this point, I start figuring what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring in a lot of monk elements and just really bulk up his waist. That's sort of what I thought would be a fun thing to do. So from the, let's say, waist up, or sort of bottom of the rib cage up, it would be fairly lean and fairly just human, just tight to his human form, and that's what the focus would be on. And since he's a monk, that sort of works out pretty cool. Maybe he primarily just fights with his hands. He doesn't even fight with his feet that much, so we get to focus on that. And that was the only visual driving design choice aside from his big bushy hair and the wrappings around his head until later, which, as you see, I come up with a different thing as the piece goes on. So now we jump down to his distant pec and we start fleshing out his body. Not a whole lot to say here until we get to the leather arm, where I use a ton of duplication of spikes, and you'll see that in a second. The spikes that I actually drew, I can talk about this, the spikes that I drew here in the rough, that's more of a normal Mike Henry, I'm going to put spikes on things, spikes. There's fewer of them, and they are big and chunky, or at least somewhat chunky, and that's more my normal aesthetic. However, I wanted to try and drive more of a gothic-y thing here. So I thought, okay, well, similar to like, say, like Sid from Slipknot, or like a Iron Maiden idea, or, you know, something like that. Let's go for smaller spikes and try to go for a lot more of them. Sort of like a sea urchin vibe, which isn't something that I normally would do design-wise, but to be honest, a lot of the characters in the series have been about me choosing to do things that I normally wouldn't do. In fact, I have another character that I'm working on after this one that I just sketched out last night that is very much not something that I would normally do. So when that one comes around, I don't mean that to say that like it's going to be mind-blowingly weird. It's just not something I normally do because I'm trying to break out of my comfort zone on some of these characters, or at the very least choose opportunities within a character to break out of my comfort zone. So you can see right there, his deltoid suddenly got a ton of spikes, and then a ton of littler spikes, and then more spikes, and that's because the way Procreate records the time lapse, it doesn't record the duplication of things as sort of like all these individual steps. So what I did was I drew that first initial spike and then duplicated it all around, and then I duplicated it for the ones that are pointed a little bit more towards us, and I vertically shrunk it and then altered the curve on the underside of the spike so that it connected correctly, and then I just sort of went through his entire deltoid replicating these, and that's how I built up that. Then on the arm, that's like a different spike altogether, which I then duplicated. And then the further down the arm is yet another spike that I duplicated a bunch of times in order to try and just really make these repetitive. I really wanted them to be repetitive, which I know sounds weird. It's similar to how in past pieces I've said that I wanted the figure to feel kind of flat. And that's not necessarily something that you go for when you're trying to do these things. But I've been trying to go for like these sort of repetitive or flat, or I don't know if I have really a good word for it, but I've been trying to go for a vibe like that on some of these in order to try and create a certain amount of stiffness in certain aspects of the designs. As I'm saying all that, I realize that it sounds a little too highfalutin, and it also sounds like I'm trying to cover up like a non-dynamic pose or a non-dynamic whatever. But honestly, that's what I'm going for. So if it's coming off the other way, then maybe I'm just full of shit. Or if it's coming off correctly, then maybe it works. I don't know. I know that people are digging these characters, so maybe that means it's working. But I guess it's really just boiling down to me trying to do some different things than I normally do, and I just hope it's sort of working out. So now we're going to wrap up the straps that are keeping the leather part of his arm on. After that, we go into more details on the arm itself. I had this idea for the way the leather was going to be almost like these layered bands of leather that are only on sections of the leather arm. So it's almost like bandages, but made out of a thin leather type thing. So that's the section that we go into next. So yeah, here you can see the lines starting to go in. This whole thing was actually really annoying to do. Once I started putting all these spikes in, I realized that doing these lines, I was then going to have to erase all of the lines where the spikes are, and then when I was going to color it, I knew I was going to have to color all these spikes, because as you know, it's much easier to do fills for big flat shapes than it is to do little pointy things where you're having to go in and out and in and out. So this was one of those things where as I was working on it, I was just like, oh god, this is going to suck when I get to that. So we wrap up doing these little leather bandage things, and these little sort of nicks and scratches, and making sure all these details are good and done. And then on the spikes, put a lot of little scratches on the spikes, try to add some wear and tear in there. And then lastly, we put some rivets where those straps attach to the sort of main chest, shoulder, harnessy type area. So now we're on to his hand, his visible hand, and we're making sure that we've got some of that anatomy a little bit more solved. I think the rough sketch was fairly good, at least as far as sketches go, but then, of course, once you start getting into it, you need to make sure that all the little details in the anatomy is as good as possible. There's actually some aspects of the sketch on this that I liked that I didn't really nail when I went to the tighter lines. And sometimes it's just the way it goes, and you have to sort of live with it. That said, I mean, I'm happy with the hand in general, but there are just certain things that I was like, that could have been better. But you'll see me sort of adjust them as I go through. So now we're just adding all those knobby knuckles and meaty bits and all that. And then I laughed there. Can you see what I did? I added an extra finger. I was sort of zoned out, and I just started adding an extra knuckle to start adding an extra finger. And then I was like, holy shit, his other finger's all the way at the top. So there you go. That was a little fun thing if you want to go back and see that. I feel like that's the number one mistake that you see throughout history is like artists adding extra fingers on all the time, especially when it's a hand-focused thing, and I guess you stop paying attention. You just keep adding finger after finger after finger. So now we're doing the arm anatomy, and at this point, I actually didn't quite have the idea for the glowy skeletal arm that this will eventually become. I sort of got that idea later as I was working on it. I knew I wanted to bring some importance to the hand, and I knew that I was continuing to search for ways that this monk character could exist in this gothic world. And I was trying to come up with things like, well, what do monks usually have? Like life force, and there's always like chi stuff going on and all that type of shit. So it's like, how do I wrap that up? How do I sort of try to couple this hopeful, positive body/earth energy with this sort of like death and sadness and all that, which is what eventually led me to the death hand, the hand of death, or whatever you want to call it. So now we're just detailing out the ripped cloth wrapped around his wrist. At this point, I've run out of excuses to work on the bottom, so now let's add stuff. So you can see here, I just start going through. I actually looked up some reference for some modern-day monk trinkets, and then wanted to continue to, just sort of flesh that out as I went through it, maybe add some things that felt more like this world that I'm building here, add more stuff, add more stuff. I just liked the visual of him having a ton of junk around his waist, and then having him be more or less kind of bare up top. And that was the inspiration around this design decision. So we've got this sort of weird gourd. Again, some of these things are going to be a little cliche on purpose because I'm trying to drive home the base, I guess, class, you could say, for this character. And then there's going to be just some extra things there that are maybe filled in narratively, as well as other elements that just feel like they go with it or they go in this world. That's the idea here. So trying to find ways to do like a little bit of the gourd thing, but it's a gourd from this world, and this world is kind of violent and dark and heavy. So there's like this opening where the water would come out of, or whatever he's carrying with him, and it's sort of jammed in there and it's damaging the gourd, and then that's corked, and then he's got all these medallions that mean something, and then he's got this belt buckle that means something. He's got the beads, and he's got sort of like a mat that's rolled up back there, whether that's used to sleep on or it's used for something else. You don't know. There's some amount of storytelling in every character design, you should be trying to tell some sort of a story, even if it's just somebody wearing a yoga outfit, you have an impression of what that character is like, right? And I say yoga outfit because that's like usually very simple. It's like stretchy pants and a tank top or something like that. But you're telling a story still. And so with this, what I wanted to point out is that sometimes you're telling a very specific story, and other times you're just telling like an impression. Or what you see a lot of the times when you look at the development artwork for a video game or a movie or an animation is you see early character designs that are just sort of implying a thing, and then later designs of that same character where things have become more solidified. Since these are sort of one-off character designs that I want to be part of the same world, you can sort of think of these as the early character designs. They're the first pass, they're the first idea. They're probably largely okay or good enough, but then there are little details that should be fleshed out much better as time goes on. So that's sort of the idea behind what I'm trying to achieve with these and the impression that I'm trying to give. So do I have a backstory for every one of these little medallions? Definitely not. But they imply something, and I think that for different people they're going to imply slightly different things, but they're ultimately going to imply the same thing, that these are meaningful to him, they come from something, and they are meaningful to wherever he came from, and that's the important part there. And so then the same thing is true with the jug, the metal sort of jug thing he has, and the, he's got, like I said, that mat, he's got some beads, he's got some other important things going around his waist there that may not be crazy important, sort of like overly obvious plot devices where it's like he shows up to some temple and they're like, oh, you're from the whatever, like not that obvious, but more just things where they are important to him as a character and they help him look like he cares about things and that he has things that mean something to him. So that's sort of the point behind all of these. So we got that mat more filled out in the background there, but then here I jump to doing the jug, and since it's a cylindrical thing, I decided to draw it symmetrical but in perspective. So we've got it at this angle, but it's mirrored, and it's using the circle tool, the circle brush, which I will reference down below. And then you can see that I'm duplicating it and then adding damage to make it asymmetrical because I'm just going to end up twisting it and warping it to fit on his belt. So there's a little rope that goes around the top, and then boom, it's warped into spot right there. Clean up some stuff, get some details a little sorted all in there, get some extra thickness around it so that it feels like it's part of the overall illustration and not sort of inserted in. And now here's the bag or satchel that he's got on the distant side, which is, he'd have different things in there. Maybe that's a more useful utilitarian thing, while some of the other stuff is more ornamental. So then I slightly shrink him to get him entirely in frame because I realized that was just going to look bad. I finish off his hair, and now we get into the flatting stage. So as you know, these will go really fast because this phase goes really fast because flatting these characters, I don't do a lot of color work on them. I deliberately keep them very flat. So you can see here that I'm flatting in his main form. I'm going around his body and trapping it and then filling it. And I actually had some value issues with this character, trying to make sure I had everything balanced. He has a dark skin tone, he's got black hair, he's got black leather, it's a dark vibe. Everything in this world is a dark vibe. And so I wanted to, and his eyes are covered, which is usually like a really good device for pulling attention where you want to pull it. So I had a lot of problems with this one. You can see his skin tone changes a bunch. I wanted his skin to be dark, but having to balance it properly was just kind of a pain in the ass. So you can see as this goes on, his skin, the leather on his arm, and maybe a couple of other elements. I think his pants too flicker throughout a bunch of different colors. This was me trying to balance the darkness that I want everything to have, because I do want it to be dark and I don't want it to be super obviously readable, but at the same time, I do want it to be readable. I want you to be able to figure out what's going on in these. So this character provided the biggest level of difficulty, the highest challenge with trying to get all of these elements perfectly balanced. And honestly, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that he's got no visible eyes. You can draw a lot of attention to eyes very easily. If you go back and you look at like the Grave, now I forgot what I called her. The Grave Templar, I think was her name. Like she's looking dead straight at you, and you can't look anywhere but her eyes. And then you sort of notice that like the ghost is there. So with this, it was like, okay, well, how am I going to get people to look at his face? How am I going to get people to pay attention to him? And this really came from a bunch of things, a bunch of value changes. Altering the color, I end up changing the color of his wrist, his cloth around his wrist, I guess you call it. I end up changing the value of his pants a lot. And then once his hand's glowing, for some reason it sort of actually works out pretty good. You get a lot of attention at that hand, and then there's something about his hand and his face that start working together at that point. So we're going to look at that hand now. It's going to come through really quickly, but don't worry, we're going to break down how I did the hand. You can see I colored it normally, and then I go in here and I do this glowy hand phase. So the first pass was me just seeing if I could do it the way I wanted, and now this is the pass where I actually do it the way that it looks in the final, where like I actually decide like, okay, now I'm going to do it and I'm going to do it right, since I proved it out in that very quick version. So if you go back, you can see the quick version, and now here you can see how I actually did it in the illustration. So if you didn't completely grasp how that was done just by watching it, I'm going to do a breakdown on that in a minute, so you'll be able to see that for sure. I added some of the dirty rustiness that I've had in the other characters right there at the end. You can still see that there's like a lot of problem drawing attention to him and his face, but I knew that I wanted to start working on the background at some point. And even though purple felt like a nice color for the background, that it was going to be different than the other pieces, it just really wasn't working. So you can see I do some detail on these towers, these sort of leaning towers that are in this like swampy, marshy, mountainy land, and I decide that that color's not working. I get it back to this more sickly color, and I start going through the piece and sort of tweaking little things here and there, because at this point I'm starting to realize that some of the legibility, the readability wasn't very strong, and so now let's go in and start tweaking some of that and fixing it. Now here we go back to that last tower, or not last tower, sorry, one of the main towers. Put a little hut on top, put a bunch of other little points of interest on there, just as these sort of little impressions of what this world is that's going on directly behind him. And then we jump over to the last tower. And sorry, we didn't jump over to it, we pull back, get the mountains in the background, and get this sort of like implied river action going on in the background. And now, okay, let's put some bounce light. Previous characters have had like a very pale rim coming off of their background, and I wanted on this one to have the rim light come off of his own glowing hand so that we could start bringing some attention to him. So by bringing this glow and this bounce up onto him, it's not necessarily like making like his eyes glow or giving him some really definitive focal point, but it's sort of reminding the eye that there is form over there, and so it still brings you over in some way. Put just a little bit of rim light coming off of the sky, very, very mildly, and then tweak just a couple of little last minute values, and that's it. That's the character. Desaturated the background as well, because I just thought going for more of a gray was going to be nice to make him pop more, so that it wasn't this big yellowy thing. So now let's talk about the Hand of Death for a second, shall we? So we're going to just do a simple orb or two and fill it with some little chunky bony type things so that you can see how that hand was done. Obviously having a darkish background is going to make whatever is glowing glow more. Something doesn't really glow in daylight because there's no contrast. It's just bright like everything else. So this is the exact color more or less of his hand. It's just this pale bright yellow. And so there's just sort of two shapes right there. You can see that the actual hand in the piece doesn't have any definition except for the lines that are on the hand. I don't do anything with creating volume within the orb. The way I create volume on the hand is through the opacity of the bone pieces. So here I create this sort of gray, warm gray bone, and I go to the soft brush because I want it to look like you're not seeing it sharply because you're seeing it through some sort of a membrane. So now here I'm just going to create a bunch of random shapes so that you can see essentially how this gets done. Get a couple of little floaty bits in here. Now we'll create another layer using the exact same color and the exact same brush, just adjusting the size. We're going to put in some connective points. So if I were doing exactly like the hand, you could think of it as all the different parts of the hand, the bones of the hand. Here though, since it's all just sort of abstract, we're just going to sort of create some connections. And I'm making it a little bit fuzzier because the idea is that this part is further back in the orb, so it's a little further away from the viewer. So once I've got a couple of these in here, we're going to go to the layer and just lower the opacity on it. So by lowering the opacity, we're of course letting some of the yellow through, which is giving the illusion that the thing is further back. There's more of the yellow in between the viewer's eye and these little fragments. So I could do this more elegantly, but what you can see here is it sort of gives this impression that this thing is coming towards us and going away from us. With bones of the finger, it's really easy to imagine that because each one of those joints is very clearly going either towards us or away from us because you're following the anatomy of the hand. So now let's take this last thing we did and lower the opacity a lot because it's really far in the background. And then we're going to select the stuff that's on top of it and delete it away from what we just added, because now that we're dealing with a bunch of transparencies, we don't want those transparencies to overlap because then they won't read as being far back or close to us. They'll read as being transparent, and that's not what we're going for. We want the yellow to be transparent, but not the things that are floating in between. So now we duplicate the big yellow orby mess and blur it. Blur it a lot for a bigger, softer glow, blur it just a little bit for a tighter glow, and then you could even blur it a lot for the big soft glow and then duplicate that original one more and just blur it a tiny bit to get a really intense glow. So there's a tight glow, a tight blur, and then a bigger, softer blur, and that gives us this sort of glowy thing. And this is how I did the glow on it. It's not very complicated. I've done, like for instance, in my piece Deddy that I did a long time ago, I did much more complex glows on the, glows and transparency, sorry, on the ghosts. But what I can show you here is something like this, for instance, would be another way to add a little bit more volume to the actual orb. So I'm taking that base orb and I'm deleting away from the glow because I don't want the glows to overlap. So now we have our glows isolated as just glows. They aren't any of the interior shape. And then we go to that interior shape that we duplicated and we erase away like that. So now we've got a soft sort of interior glow, but really it's not trying to show that it's interiorly glowing. It's showing that it's got density on the edges. And then we take that other bigger shape and we lowered its opacity. So now what we've done is we've created a orb shape, as you can see here by me changing the color, that has a see-through quality as well as it has some sort of thickness to it that's represented in the sort of softer interior glow that we've got going on there. So this is a more complex way of doing something like that. But both of them are sort of valid, but in the piece that I'm doing, I wanted to go for something a little bit more stylized, so I tried not to represent it too accurately to I don't know, I say accurately, but how often do you actually see somebody's skin just glow and be able to see their bones through it? So now just to show you again on a hand, this is a super crude hand where I'm just taking that big glowy color and I'm going to just block out a very badly drawn hand for you so you can see it in practice directly with a hand again. Okay, so just as before, we've got now a badly blocked in glow hand, but it's not glowing, it's not anything, it's just yellow paint on this sort of blue background. And we're going to take these bone pieces. Now, I treated them in the piece on a fairly cartoony way, and that was sort of on purpose. I wanted them to be really symbolic and obvious, and obviously the piece itself isn't super realistic. So we're going to do something like that here too. We're just going to block these in. Now these aren't super anatomically correct, so don't take this into any type of biology class or anything. But this is me just sort of blocking in very crudely the bones. And you can see in the layer stack that I just had opened up, I'm building them in the same way that I just did on the orbs, where we've got the ends of the fingers, which are somewhat the closest thing to us. They definitely are on the pinky there. And then underneath that, we have the next layer, which is the continued phalanges. And so as we're moving through the joints, they're actually getting pushed further back. So now you can see on that layer stack, we've got one more that we're doing. So again, this is just bone bullshittery, but it's just to try and get the point across here. So now those we lower all the way in opacity, then we lower the pinky just a little bit, then we lower the next one just a little bit. And so now you can see here, we'll select, just like before, we don't want these bones to be transparent. We just want them to appear like they are surrounded by more hand meat than other parts. So this sort of ends up creating a little bit of a vibe like the tips of the fingers are the closest to us and then they're sort of trailing off. Now this is done really badly, obviously. There are better ways that you can do this entire thing to try and get this to look better. Like for instance in the actual piece, it looks better because I put more work into it. But this shows you the gist of how you can solve this problem. Now the thing that I can't stress enough is that the reason that I did this method wasn't because this is like an obvious method and you just sort of do this and yeah, every artist knows how to do this. It's not really that. It's more about experimentation and observation and trying to think to myself, well, what do I want? I want the hand to be see-through. Okay, well, if it's going to be see-through, then what do I need to show that it's see-through? Well, I need whatever's inside it to be affected by the thing that's outside it. Well, how do I do that? Well, I've only got a few things that can do that, like color and value and, these normal art things. So the bone is going to be affected by the glowing skin in the fact that it is inside it. So the yellow has to show through on the bone on some level. This, by the way, is me doing the other method I showed you with the orbs before, except on the hand. So by doing that, I naturally came to the conclusion that using the bones and doing them in different opacities was how I was going to get there. I know that that's a muscle that you need to develop. I'm not saying that it's super easy to come up with a methodology like that, but the more and more you observe things and the more and more you try to solve these problems, the more and more you're going to find the solutions. So now, here we are again back at the hand. Let's look at this much more slowly than we did before so you can see it. So the first thing I do is I use a soft airbrush to fill in the arm white because that's how I want it to glow. Then I very crudely went in and I just started plugging in all the bone pieces. And they're done in a bit of a stylized manner. Then I used a mask on the lines so that I could reduce the strength of the lines in the center of where all those fingers sort of conglomerate. And then we've got the bones. Now this is my more final pass. So the first thing I do is I draw in all the bones that are closest to the viewer. Then I start working on the bones that are next furthest away. So we've got the tips of the fingers in some spots, and we've got the third phalange or whatever you want to call it. Then we've got the carpals and the metacarpals. Then we've got the bones of the arm, so the humerus and the radial and the ulna. And so now here we are with, and then I did a little bit of a fade off on the bone because it gets back to where his arm turns into his regular skin, his normal arm. And then I just quickly went in and I erased away some of the edging so that it could really make that hand feel like there's some extra thickness to that skin around there. Then we just throw in these little dots that I put on because I wanted it to look like there was some sort of little energy bits breaking off. And that's it. So I hope this was really cool. I know a lot of people really wanted to see a breakdown on that hand, so I tried to do as much as I could that made sense. I hope that it did make sense, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching the Disciple get created. And there's more to come in the A Village Corrupted character series, and you'll see some soon. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing. See you guys later. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.